What is up, people? This is Pete Clark, aka Characters, and welcome back to episode 77 of the Carrot Poker Podcast. Today's episode is on solving dry king high boards. Very specific of you, Pete, you may think. And yes, I suppose it is. But what I wanted to do today was bring you guys a technical segment. I have a few guests lined up, and thank you so much for all of you that contacted me to get on the podcast, all three of you so far. We're going to have a software developer, poker tool software developer on the show soon. We are going to have an actual female human being on the show as well, which in the poker community is obviously much rarer than it is in most industries. And so that in and of itself is a little bit unique and exciting, but she's also quite interesting in other ways. And we'll see that when we do that episode. We also have an author coming on the show as well who has written a poker book for beginners in the near future. Don't hold me to it if any of these guests cancels, but the point is I'm very grateful that you guys felt you could get in touch, and I'd urge more of you to do so. Just email me admin@carrotcorner.com or add me right away. Don't be shy on Skype. My username there, unsurprisingly, is Characters, same as my PokerStars name. So add me there and we can chat if you think you want to be on the show. I'm just looking for anyone. You don't need to be famous. If you are famous, if you're like a really famous person listening to this, yes, please email me. If you're famous for poker, I don't want like actors or like football players coming on the show. You can just go and do your own thing. Don't need you guys. But if you're actually famous in poker or not famous in poker, but you're just like an aspiring player who has something a little bit unique to add to the podcast, maybe you're a software developer, maybe you're a I don't know, like maybe you specialize in acting and psychology, know lots about live tells. Maybe you're just listening to this and thinking there's something a bit weird and unique about me as a person that makes me interesting. You don't have to be wildly weird and wonderful, just something a little bit quirky or unique. Send me a message, email me admin@carrotcorner.com, add me on Skype as Characters. We will get you on the show. Anyway, today we're going to talk about strategy. The word solving in the title does pertain to the use of a solver. One of the things that I do very often when I study, in fact it is basically the only way that I study these days, is to review hands and run them through Pile Solver. I love Pile Solver because it is objective truth. Sometimes in forums, poker study groups that people are all a part of, they work with like 14 other players. You know, my student will have his 14 buddies on his group and he'll post a hand for review and he'll be like, guys, should I just call this river or should I raise with this like second nuts? What should I do? And the reason that he is so confused when he messages me about the hand or wants coaching and wants to discuss the hand in lesson 1 is that he's been given 7 answers that are like, you must raise here, you absolute idiot, what are you doing by calling? This is awful. You can't play the second nuts that way, you nit. And then another 6 people who have been like, yeah, this seems really good because villain's range, blah, blah, blah. Can't raise without the nuts in this spot. And he's just like, help. With Solver, you don't get any of that ambiguity, you don't get any of that kind of blind leading blind kind of thing that can, not in all cases, some groups are good, but in cases where you have a bunch of different people being coached by different people who are not being coached at all and just repeating like parrots stuff they've listened to on videos or podcasts, even like this one, you're going to get a mixed bag of opinions and it's going to be confusing. So when you work with a solver, you can see what the case would be at equilibrium. Now when I say at equilibrium, and I'm going to say that quite a lot during this episode, what I'm referring to is how a perfect poker computer plays against itself, how it splits up its range. You give it the ranges to start with, we give it some sizing options, we give it the flop, turn and river. It gives us its ineffable wisdom about how it would play against itself to the point where it can no longer gain any expected value, EV, by deviating from that strategy. So what you get here is a kind of equilibrium. It's basically 2 extremely good and identical players cancelling each other out in the long term, with a focus on ranges. Now, before we get into any analysis of these dry king high boards that are going to be today's technical topic, it's going to be important to point out that a solver does not tell us how we should play in a specific hand against a specific individual opponent. Very often in poker, and thank God this is true, you can gain extra EV by deviating from what would be known as the optimal or equilibrium strategy, thereby changing your range in some way or changing your action with a hand in some way where you gain from it exploitatively. In other words, if villain is making some kind of exploitative deviation himself, knowingly or unknowingly, from the theoretical solution, then we want to exploit in the other direction for as long as that's not going to come back to bite us. And by that I mean that if you make a very obvious over-exploitation, like if a guy's 3-betting you too much and you start shoving any 2 cards, that's probably not going to go down too well long term. So what you want to do is make sure your exploits are in moderation, that they are not obvious, that they will be effective long term if you're going to play this guy in the long term. If it's just some random recreational player who's joined your table and is spewing, you just want to call him down light and you don't need to worry about the repercussions. But generally, when we make exploits, we want to be a little bit careful against solid regs that we play with day in, day out, that we don't overdo it. But today, we're not going to be talking about doing any exploitation at all. We're going to be talking about what the highest EV play would be according to the solver. In other words, at equilibrium. I may sort of gravitate off in an exploitative direction where I think that's relevant. I may say, for example, the pool is not doing what the solver's recommending here, and here's why, and here's what we can do about it. But for the most part, I'm going to be explaining to you guys why PioSolver, which is a solver I use, other solvers are available, chooses to do what it chooses to do. I think this is important. When a student comes to me and says, I work with Pio every day, I'm not going to lie, my initial reaction is, oh dear. Now, the reason I react a little bit skeptically when someone says they work a lot with PioSolver is that the majority of amateur players use PioSolver use it very badly. They try to memorize lots and lots of strategies, which is impossible for humans to do. They don't understand why the solver is recommending what it is, and they try to form reasoning for it that is just wacky and wrong and is then contradicted in future by further simulations that they do on the solver, or they just never find out that it's wrong and they end up just taking bad default strategies. Or 3, they over apply what the solver does and make GTO based plays or their imitation of them, not always that accurate, against a weaker player who is just screaming to be exploited in some very simple and obvious way in a vacuum, meaning just in that one hand you can play your cards in such a way that destroys him, but you're not doing that because you're mixing 40% call into your range, 40% fold and 20% raise. You don't want to mix against a weak player because generally you want to take the highest EV action, which is very explicitly clear, 100% of the time, for the simple reason that it's the highest EV action. So when we talk about mixing today, meaning taking one action with a hand sometimes and taking a different action with the same hand in the same spot other times, we're going to be talking about an equilibrium play that you should often just not do against weaker players or in weaker pools at lower stakes. So with that said, let's fuel our GTO knowledge a little bit. The first flop we're going to talk about today is going to be King of Hearts, 6 of Diamonds, 3 of Spades, or basically any King 6-3 rainbow texture. Our template situation is going to be button against big blind, and button is going to open 2.7x in this simulation. And the reason for that is that that's the size that I use, and I'm very ego mad and want the solver to do as I do. All my students as well, a lot of them, also use 2.7x, and that's like a cult following now on PokerStars. If you see someone open the button 2.7x, beware, he's one of my proteges, maybe. Or maybe just one of my students, or maybe it's coincidence, who knows. But anyway, this King 6-3 board is going to be very, very good for the buttons range. And I think the reasons for that are quite obvious. The button is opening an uncapped range, meaning he can have all kinds of hands right up to the top. Meanwhile, big blind is going to be 3-betting pre-flop with aces, with queens, with jacks, with kings, with ace-queen, with ace-jack suited, with ace-queen off, with ace-king. So, needless to say, the big blind has way less combos of ace-king and aces and king-queen suited and king-jack suited and king-10 suited, as these are some of the better hands possible on this King 6-3 dry texture, King of Hearts, 6 of Diamonds, 3 of Spades. It's going to mean that Hero's range on the button is going to be much, much stronger than Villain's range. And if we look at, basically these ranges are not like definitively the absolute optimal pre-flop ranges, but they are the ones I've input into the solver here are the ones that I think people take these actions with. So I think my button range just basically epitomizes what people do in the pool, and my big blind defense range kind of epitomizes what people do, at least at higher stakes where they understand the importance of blind defense. You might see people defend tighter than the range I have input here at the micro stakes if they're ABC regulars, because the big blind defense range that I'm looking at right now goes down to things like 5-2 suited, mixing, call and fold, Jack 4 suited, usually calling, Queen 7 off, calling, against a 2.7x raise, which I think is like borderline but probably okay, but this could be a bit tighter in certain situations. It could also be wider, but most ABC regs at the stakes that many of you play, like 25NL or something, or lower, are going to fold more than this because they don't understand pot entitlement and pot odds pre-flop, and they just don't like to play queen 8 off, and they don't realise that, yes, they'll lose money by calling it to the open out of the big blind, but they'll lose less than if they fold, in which case their loss rate is minus 100 big blinds per 100. The way we can see that is just imagine that they lose a big blind every time they fold. Over 100 hands, they lose 100 BBs. Maybe by defending the queen 8 off, they only lose 84 BBs every 100 hands, or 0.84 BBs every hand. So take these with a pinch of salt. Ranges can be a bit different in reality, but these ranges are very wide, both of them, and the reason that the big blind player suffers so much here is that not only does he lack some of the nutted hands that the button has, but he also gets to this flop with a lot of utter drivel trash hands like queen 7 off, like 9-5 suited, that are very bad on king 6-3 rainbow. And us on the button, we don't have those hands. Some of the worst hands that we even have on this texture would be like, we do have things like 8-5 suited or whatever, but for the most part, we don't have a whole lot of terrible junk here. Like some of our weakest hands are at least ace high and things like that on this board. So we want to bet very often. Why do you want to bet very often when you have a big range advantage? The reason for this is simple. Villain has to overfold relative to the math of the situation. Normally, if I bet 1/3 of the pot, which is going to be Button's bet size in the simulation here, or one of his bet sizes, and indeed the only one that he chooses, or that Pio chooses, if I bet 1/3 of the pot, you're supposed to defend 75% of the time. The reason for that is I'm risking 1 unit to win 3 units. My bet needs to work 25% of the time with 0 equity bluffs to break even. And if you want to stop that from being the case, you're going to have to defend 75% of your range to stop me making money with any 2 cards. In this spot, you can't do that because as the big blind, your range is at far too much of an inherent disadvantage. What that means is that you're going to actually fold really often to my 33% pot size bet. You have to do that because if you try to defend the quote-unquote mathematical minimum defense frequency of 75%, you're going to get burned so badly later on with all of your range disadvantages and not disadvantages that you lose more money at equilibrium than you would by just overfolding on the flop relative to that defense frequency in the first place. So we have to be a little bit careful with that. When we are big blind here, we need to make sure that we don't try to defend that mathematically quote-unquote correct amount that's actually very incorrect when it comes to the game theory of equilibrium. So when we c-bet 1/3 pot, so we're going to bet 19 into a pot of 59 here. The pot is 59 because there's a dead small blind that's worth 5, and I've opened to 27 in this 5-10 sort of model, and Villain has called, so 54 plus 5 is 59. That's where the starting pot comes from. Starting stacks are 1000 BBs here, but down to 973 after both players invest 27 before the flop. At 100 NL, this is like a raise to $2.70. The pot's effectively $5.90 on the flop. Small blind is folded pre-donating that dead money. So when we bet 19, about 1/3 pot, Villain is actually supposed to fold 40% of the time, 40.57% of the time on my sim. That is almost twice as often as he's meant to fold if the flop was neutral. And the reason he folds this often is that the flop is not neutral whatsoever. In fact, on this flop, if we look at the EV of both players, the expected value, our EV is 39.78 out of 59. That's about 2/3 of the pot. It's basically 40 chips we get back on average, even though the pot is 60 chips. So we're actually entitled to, if both players play optimally and perfectly, we're entitled to 40 chips out of 60. That's very good for us. We're just effectively taking a bunch of big blinds pre-flop call and adding it to our stack. If you're ever entitled to like more than half the pot like that, you're doing very, very well indeed. Another way you can frame the advantage here is to look at it in terms of equity instead of EV, which is your percentage chance to win at showdown. If the ranges are flipped face up now, our range against his, the equity of our range against his range here is 56.4%, which is really huge because this is no limit hold'em, and this is a game where both players have air all the time, and because of that, you can't really gain a gigantic equity advantage on a dry flop like King 6-3, or indeed on any flop. In fact, you can gain a bigger one on this flop than you can on a wet one. But 56.4% equity is ginormous, and the reason you want to bet very, very often with that equity is that much of it is vulnerable. Many of our fairly high EV hands here, for example 7-6 suited here on King 6-3, this is a hand that button is actually entitled to a lot of the pot with. It has 68% equity against villain's range. That's huge, and we want to bet because we want to protect that equity. When we have 7-6 here, although you will sometimes hear less experienced players argue that checking is correct because, quote unquote, no better hand calls, do that in a really like kind of silly voice to make fun of the person that says it, of course. No better hand calls and no worse hand calls and no better hands fold or whatever. That's not even true. Like, worse hands do call when you bet 1/3 pot. That's one of the reasons we bet 1/3 pot. It turns a hand like 7-6 into some thin value. But even if that weren't the case, even if villain did fold all of his worst hands, we'd be really happy about that too, because what we're gaining is protection, we're denying equity to our opponent, and we're basically boosting that 67% equity up to 100% against much of his range, because if he folds now, guess what guys, we get 100% of the pot, right? Call that 100% equity. It's just that it comes in the form of fold equity, not pot equity. So we want to bet really often on King 6-3 Rainbow. It's just what we want to do is in position. PioSolver says that we should actually bet 90% of the time. Now, what would I do if I were you in reality and you were sat on the button on King 6-3 in position? I wouldn't build the 10% checking range. I would bet 100%. There's two reasons for that. One, you're a human, not a robot. You don't want to have to balance a really, really weird 10% checking range. Like, this checking range in Pio is not just these 10% of hands check and they're really specific. No, actually what that means is that almost every hand always bets, but some hands like pocket queens check like 27% of the time, and ace 9 checks like 15% of the time, and 7-5 checks 0.4 or 4% of the time, and the hand 7-6 that we talked about before checks only 3% of the time. Don't bother doing that bet everything. It's basically what the solver is doing. When offered the choice between 1/3 pot and 2/3 and 3/4 pot here, Pio chose to bet 1/3 pot 63% of the time and to bet big 27.5% of the time, checking the rest. Those big bets are not mandatory. You can add them in sometimes if you want, but they don't tend to gain you a ton of EV. The gain that they will have there at equilibrium, so in game theory, is not very big. And actually, if you think about it, against the micro small stakes population, 1/3 pot is probably a much higher EV size. Why do you guys think that is? Well, pause and think about it if you want, but assuming that you've had to think about it, the reason for that is that the lower stakes population will really struggle to meet an adequate defense frequency against your small bet. Because when we bet 19 into 59, 1/3 pot, villain has to call us with some very, very speculative hands. For example, ace 7 offsuit on this King 6-3 board is mixing call into its frequency 68% of the time and only folding 23% of the time for most combos. So something like a bare naked ace high that looks really ugly to call a bet with is supposed to call 1/3 pot here to stop villain from overfolding even more and getting totally crushed. And the reason for that is we're betting a whole range, and we have a lot of 8 high in our range, so of course he does want to defend ace high, at least with a bigger kicker. He doesn't want to defend ace deuce off, that hand's too weak according to the solver. But the point is that most people won't do that, and therefore betting the dry king high board for 1/3 pot is going to have even higher EV than it does at equilibrium, so we'll be entitled to even more than 40 chips out of 60 against the average player, because he'll lose a bit of EV when he starts to fold ace 8 and ace 9 and hands like that. And pocket deuces, for what it's worth, is meant to always call the 1/3 pot size bet. I can see population folding that quite a good chunk of the time, so we can see why this bet of 1/3 pot is gaining a ton of EV, even more than it does in the game theory solution. Okay, so when we've bet 1/3, villain is meant to call most of the time. He's also meant to do a ton of raising. In my sim here against my tiny bet, the solver raises 34% of hands. Sorry, no, it doesn't. That's the wrong node. I had him donking out there. The solver raises 18% of hands. I thought that looked a bit high. 18% though is still a good deal more than what most people raise here, because this solver is raising king queen all the time. It's raising a bunch of its 2 pair. It's even raising king jack and king 10 and king 9 and king 8 on King 6-3 when they have a backdoor draw. And it's bluffing with some hands that most people wouldn't bluff with, like ace deuce with a backdoor and ace five with a backdoor, and it's even raising a pair of threes for protection and stuff like that as well sometimes. So this guy in the big blind, this Pio in the big blind, is just raising a lot more than population does, and that's another reason why betting 100% of the time for a small sizing will gain a lot of EV against population, even more than it does against solver. Okay, let's talk a little bit about turns, shall we? So what we're going to look at today is basically just a blank turn. When we bet 1/3 pot on king 6-3 and villain calls and we get a blank turn such as a, let's say, a deuce. It's not totally blank because 4-5 gets there and whatever, but it's just one hand. So let's say deuce of clubs. So the board is now king of hearts, 6 of diamonds, 3 of spades, deuce of clubs, and big blind is going to check to us again here. Given that he is procedurally supposed to check, he's capped his range now. He's called the flop, not raised. That means that his range has been capped. It also means that we should use big turn sizings. And the reason we should do that is that when villain has a capped range, he can never beat our unique hands. Those are the hands that we can have that he can't. So when he doesn't raise the flop, he hardly ever has king queen. He doesn't have ace king because he would have raised it on the flop if he did have it, but moreover, he doesn't even have it pre-flop. And he doesn't have a set anymore, or even 4-5 very often, because 4-5, that open-ended straight draw, that was basically his best bluff that he could raise us with on the flop. So he's going to raise us with that hand there and then a lot of the time. So when we get to this deuce of clubs turn, he is basically capped at like a hand like king jack offsuit or without the back door. Even king jack and king 10 with backdoor flush draws were raising us on the flop really often. So villain is going to get here super capped, we're going to get here super uncapped. However, what has happened to equities? Well, equities have changed now, and actually our equity has gone down substantially. Our total equity is now only 45%. How did that happen? I thought we were a favourite. Well, we were, but then we bet 100% of our range, and villain called only 60% of his, or 60% minus the raises of his. What that means is that villain's range strengthened while ours stayed the same, and his range moved ahead of us in terms of equity. However, in terms of EV, we're still entitled to quite a lot of the pot. 51 chips out of what is now a 97 chip pot after our flop bet of 19 gets called. So there's now 59 base pot, our 19 and his 19, now that's 97. And the EV has gone to 51.33 for us, meaning that we are still a favourite to win more chips than he is, even though he's just filtered his range and we haven't. Even though we just won the pot 40% of the time, the entire pot, 40% of the time on the flop, we're still entitled to more than half of this new pot on the turn, despite the fact that we have an equity disadvantage now, range versus range. What's going on, guys? Well, the solution is based on the fact that we have a nut advantage. Our range is really strong at the top, meaning that the best hands that we can have that show up green on my screen in Pio, things like aces, ace king, kings, king queen suited with a backdoor, whatever, on the flop. The point is he'd have raised his if they had backdoors on the flop. Sets, straights, some two pair like king 3 suited, king 6 suited, king 2 suited. These hands are insanely strong, and he never has them. So what we do now to make sure that our EV stays that high at equilibrium is we start incorporating overbets into our range. I've given Pio solver the option now, excuse the squeaky chair as I try and get comfortable, the option of either betting 75% of the pot, which he's doing 16% of the time, and betting 150% of the pot, the overbet size, which he's doing 16% of the time. We should note that we usually check this turn. Why do we check when our EV is so high? Because our EV resides in the top of our range and bluffing with the bottom of our range, not middle strength hands. He has more of those. Villain has a higher concentration of pair X here, like 6x, 3x, king X, deuce X. He also has a higher concentration of good ace highs and stuff like that, probably, or ace high in general, maybe, because he folded a lot of his 8 high and 7 high and jack high and queen high on the flop. So that's why villain has an equity advantage here, and that's why we don't want to bet very often. When your range has an equity disadvantage, you do not want to do a lot of betting at all. But when you do bet, because you have all the top hands and he doesn't, you want to apply maximal pressure. And for that reason, we're going to go ahead and bet really, really big here with quite a wide sub-range when we do bet. And Pio was strongly, strongly favouring the overbet with many of the nutted hands. For example, pocket threes, pocket deuces, and pocket aces, so sets and overpairs basically, and sixes as well, the other set, are betting 146 chips into 97. Almost full frequency, meaning they're never checking and they're never betting smaller. And the reason for that is that they can't lose. So the more money they bet, the more they win. At this point in coaching sessions, students often say to me, but Pete, that doesn't make sense. If I bet big like that, he'll just fold all his worst hands. Okay, so do you bluff every single time you have air? No, I never bluff as an overbet. Why not? Because you'll call me and then I don't have any equity. But hold on a minute, mate. You just said that Villain was going to fold all of his worst hands. So how can he then call you? Point is that students have very deluded, scrambled, hallucinogenic thought processes that are caused by weird, uninvestigated assumptions. I was kind of joking there when I called him mate, by the way. I was like gritting my teeth and being really annoyed at having to listen to the same leak over and over again. Get coached by me, I'll be nice to you. See, it's a good advert. But the point is here that students get seriously deluded in that they don't want to overbet for value because it's not in their little paradigm box that they learned poker in 2001. Of course it wasn't. Harrington didn't know about overbetting, probably. No offense, Harrington. But the point is that back then a lot of stuff was very anti-GTO. We had no concept of solvers. We didn't understand that overbetting gained EV with your whole range when your range is polarized and uncapped against capped range. And this is what this is. We're uncapped against capped. He's capped, we're not. So by overbetting, our value hands win more money and we force him to defend more often, range versus range, by just bluffing. As long as we bluff sometimes, it's okay if he folds everything, then our overbets make more money. So it's never right here for us to say Villain should be doing X, therefore we can't overbet, because overbetting is optimal at equilibrium. So if Villain folds too much, that doesn't mean you shouldn't overbet. What it means is you should overbet exploitatively and actually use a bluff heavy range. If you want to go down the other road and say Villain's a station, he's going to call my overbet, so I shouldn't overbet, that's nonsense as well. It just means you shouldn't overbet bluff and you should do it for value. Or if you do bluff, you should have a ton of equity, which you can't have on this board anyway. So you should do it for value. So you should overbet here against almost anybody. It's just that maybe you should do it with an unbalanced range if they're playing badly, and maybe you should do it with a balanced range if they're playing well, or you don't know how they're playing badly. So, for example, we should be overbetting on this deuce turn board king 6-3 deuce as button after flop goes check, bet, call, and he checks turn. We should be overbetting with aces, we should be overbetting with king queen, we should be overbetting with some ace king, sets, two pair, that sort of thing. And we can also bet 3/4 pot with a hand like pocket kings. Why do we bet 3/4 pot with top set but bet an overbet with everything else? Because top set blocks his calling range. Top set blocks him from having king X, and that makes it really difficult to get paid off when you put in 1.5 times the pot. This turn strategy is as polarized as it is simple, as it is beautiful, as it is easy to learn. It's really simple to do. You just bet a low frequency of the time, and when you do bet, you say to Villain, eat it, pal. I've got all the nuts you don't. Do you really want to call 146 chips into 73? Sorry, into 97. He probably doesn't with many hands, and you gain immensely by bluffing against those. The times he does call you, your nuts will make lots of money. It's win-win. There's nothing to lose by doing this. This is how you should play. If you don't believe me and you want to think inside a box and not ever overbet because you weren't taught to in 2007, fine. I'll take your money. No offense, guys. It's just there'll be someone out there that's still sitting there like, I don't like it. It doesn't fit with my beliefs. I don't like it. Well, get with the times. This is the future of poker, and this is not even just the future, it's the present, and this is like what happens now at the games I play and the games that high stakes people play and the games that even like a lot of my students play. People have learned how to overbet. So if you're not doing this and you never overbet because it doesn't fit with your previous system of beliefs, it's time to like basically adapt or die. Sorry to be harsh, but I'm in that kind of mood tonight. I feel like berating you guys. Just kidding, love you guys. So on this turn spot then, that's how we play. If we do overbet, let's follow this node. Villain is meant to fold 60% of the time. Why? Because now ranges are equal and 60% is his required fold percentage to make us indifferent to bluffing a zero equity hand. What that means is that if we risk 1.5 units to win 1 unit, we need 60% folds to break even, assuming we can't win at showdown. And the way he can make us indifferent to doing that is to call basically 40% of his range, and that's what he's doing. So when he has a king, he's always calling. When he has a 6, he's sometimes calling. If he has a pair plus draw, like pocket 5s or 4s, he's sometimes calling. If he has the nuts, because he's like just suddenly made, like he doesn't even have 5-4 here, that raises flop all the time. Let's say he has like 2 pair, like 3 deuce suited. Again, he's just calling. He's never raising our overbet because we are repping the nuts or air. So why would he want to raise top pair? It wouldn't make any sense. Why would he want to bluff raise? He wouldn't. You can beat a bluff just by calling. So when your opponent does overbet at you on the turn, you don't raise because that would just simply ruin your EV every time you're against the value hand, and it would stop your opponent bluffing. When you have a good hand, that would ruin your EV against a bluff as well. So raising this turn overbet is a nonsensical play on the king 6-3 deuce run out. And you will say, what are you doing? Like, my range is so polar, why are you raising me? I either have a huge hand that's going to usually bet again, or I have nothing. And moreover, biggest reason, number one reason why villain in the big blind should not raise your turn overbet on king 6-3 deuce is that he has actually capped his range on the flop. He doesn't even have 4-5 because that's meant to pure raise flop. It's the best possible semi-bluff in a spot where he has to raise 18% of hands. So this is a really instructive sim, guys. This turn spot is super, super instructive. And if you can follow the logic for why Pio overbets here and why he defends 40% against it, you will be understanding the essence of game theory and what's one of the simplest spots in the game, which is an uncapped versus capped, in position versus out of position, dry board with a king in it that's much better for the in position player. If you can play that spot, that's a good sort of base for branching off and learning how to play other boards in GTO. Let me deal with those of you who are sitting there at this point going, okay, very good, but I don't want to play game theory, I play 5NL. My comeback to that, it's a very petty word, isn't it? It's like a kid in the playground, comeback. My comeback to that is that, well, if you can understand game theory, then you can understand how to exploit people. If you have no idea what's optimal in game theory, your ideas about how to exploit people are largely kind of just arbitrary and probably wrong in a lot of cases, and just vacuum based. You're not thinking about range as well, and you're probably going to be wrong about exploitation if you're wrong about game theory. Sure, if you're against an absolute whale and you know he calls everything, you just value bet huge and don't bluff, fine. But let's not talk about the micro stakes as if your only opponent is that absolute whale that never ever folds. That is sometimes the case, but usually you're against a player that at least tries to play some kind of game theory optimal strategy, or at least tries to play something sensible. And against that, you're going to want to understand game theory because you want to know how to play properly. On the river, just to finish off for today's strategy segment and podcast, if villain does call our turn overbet, remember he never raises it, and let's say we get a river that's kind of a blank. Let's say it's like the 10 of spades, so just a 10. Villain checks over his whole range again at this point to us, in theory. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to again bet super often, like we did on the flop. Why have we gone bet everything on the flop, bet rarely on the turn, and then bet really often on the river again? We bet 60% of the time here. The reason for that is that we already cut most of the crap out of our turn range by checking there. So when we did bet the turn, we got to the river with like a really polarized and strong value range and then bluff range. So we don't have as many random medium combos to shave out of our range here. We're actually just going to be applying pressure in a continued way with the nuts and then bluffing. The options that Pio has now are shove for 808 chips, all in, or 292 into a pot of 389. So I've said to Pio, either you can bet 2/3 pot here, or you can just rip it in for like a gigantic overbet, essentially. These are your options at this point. And normally Pio will bet smaller because it does want to bet hands like King Queen, still for value. The board by this point is King 6-3 deuce 10, rainbow. But there are certain hands that he does want to rip with sometimes, and these are like the sets of the world and the 4-5 of the world, the straights, because these hands never lose. So when we shove with them again, it's the same idea as on the turn. Yes, villain might not want to call us, but if he wants to overfold, then we're just going to bluff. Because if we do shove here, he still has to call 32% of the time. Because we're risking double pot, so he has to defend a third of the time. He has to fold 2/3 of the time to make us indifferent. Because if he folds 2/3 of the time, we will break even by bluffing 2 times the pot. We're risking 2 to win 1. 66%, 2 and 3. Risk divided by risk plus reward, guys, right? In the Grounders Manual, my book. Check it out. All these foundational things that Pio is using here are all in the Grounders Manual. If you've not bought the Grounders Manual, you can get it on my website. You get 100 hands as well for 25% off at that point. Just go to carrotcorner.com, click Grounders Manual, and go to the store. Buy Grounders Manual first and you'll get a discount on 100 hands. Buy both books at once, you save a bit of money. But anyway, back to the sim. Required fold equity, which is one of the fundamental concepts, one of the first ones you'll meet in the Grounders Manual, is the thing that governs how often villain should defend here. And what villain does is he goes into his weak, capped, horrible range and he plays the role of the defender, the guy with tiny EV, really low EV here, and just tries to scrape back as much balance in EV as he can, and sanity, by defending certain combinations like King Jack and King 10 that made 2-pair, and if he does have a set of deuces that he made on the turn, he will call that. Remember, he doesn't have a set of 6s because he would have raised the King 6 pre-flop. So the Pio in the big blind now is basically calling when he has something good, and usually just folding his second pair, folding most of his top pair, being careful that he doesn't pay us off too often, lest our value hands gain too much money, and also being careful he doesn't fold too often, or else our bluffs will gain too much money. So a hand like King 9 for villain there is a pure fold, and that's going to be because it blocks some of our bluffs. Some of the hands that we're bluffing on this river, just for example, are Jack 9, because it blocks King Jack, and Jack 8, because it blocks King Jack, which is one of his higher frequency calling hands. So that's how that spot goes at equilibrium. Button opens 2.7x, big blind calls. Button bets all of his range for mainly a small sizing on the flop. Again, big blind needs to raise off in here, but this time he calls in the path that we're following. And when he does raise the flop, he raises polarized against that button c-bet. The turn is the deuce of clubs, and on that card, big blind checks its whole range because he's now suffering from a bad nut disadvantage, having capped his range by not raising flop. We apply pressure with both big bets and overbets. We bet overbets with our nutted stuff, or best kings, or over pair of aces, stuff like that, and then some bluffs. And we use the big bet that's not an overbet, the 75% pot, with more like second pair hands, other king X, some 2-pair, pocket kings that blocks his calls, stuff like that. Big blind defends on the turn to the overbet. Follow that path now. Only 40% of the time, because he's trying to make us indifferent to bluffing. We're risking 1.5 to win 1. He needs to defend 40% to cause us to break even when we're bluffing. On the river, which is the 10 of spades, having called our overbet, villain checks everything again, and we mix between a big bet and an overbet of all in, and we use the overbet all in with more like 2-pair and sets, and we use the big bet with our better king X, and we balance bluffs into both of those ranges as well, things like the Jack 9 and Jack 8. So that's how that spot goes at equilibrium. I hope I've explained to you guys why that's the case. It's been a lot of detail on just one board today, but this is the kind of detail you need to get stuck into if you want to understand GTO. Again, final point, why should you understand GTO? Because it will make you a better poker player all round. It will make you understand the game in a very good way. It will not just teach you how to play one spot, but that poker sense that you gain from understanding game theory in one spot will basically allow for way more flexibility in game, way more adaptation, and way more just understanding and comfort. So let me know if you liked this episode. Email me, admin@carrotcorner.com, and tell me what you think. If you thought this was a good segment and you like strategy segments like this and you'd like to see more in-depth game theory kind of podcasts, let me know. If you prefer the light-hearted podcasts with guests and interviews and chatting, also let me know. Some podcasts will be like this, some won't. my book Poker Therapy will be out in a couple of months, so if you're listening to this after the end of October, go to Carrot Corner, pick it up. There'll probably be a discount code. Listen to later podcasts to find out what that is. I'm really happy with the mental game book so far. I was working on it in a coffee shop today for a few hours, and I was getting really into it, and I'm super pumped to bring you guys that book. Stay tuned, but in the meantime, pick yourself up a copy of Grinders Manual or 100 Hands at carrotcorner.com. Email me for coaching, admin@carrotcorner.com, and same email address if you want to come on the podcast and talk to me about anything. Love to hear from more of you guys, and thank you so much for all the support and encouragement that you've given me on the podcast so far. I've actually just realized recently how many of you like this podcast. It is way more popular than I thought. Maybe I had a deflated sense of my own ability, or I don't know, but you guys are listening to this in spades, and I didn't realize that was the case. So this podcast is coming to you weekly from now on. That's a guarantee. It's no longer a half-hearted promise. Weekly podcasts every Thursday or Friday. Stay tuned. Next one will be out next week on the whatever of September that is. It's now the 29th of August, so do the math. My brain's spent from GTO analysis. I can't work it out. Alright guys, thanks for watching and have a good day. Bye bye for now.